Jim B. Miller was known by many names. Deacon Jim, due to his association with the Methodist Church, the long frock coats he wore, and his habits of never drinking or smoking. He was also known as Killin Jim and Killer Miller. Both of these nicknames be much more fitting than that of Deacon. Jim Miller was the Wild West version of a modern-day hitman. At the time of his death, he laid claim to killing 51 men, and his favorite tool for the job was a shotgun. So join me as we learn all about the life of Deacon Jim on this profanity-free episode of Bloody Beaver Podcast. That's right, I said profanity-free. I'm going to see how long I can go without cussing on this episode. Not making any promises, though. Today's tale is a crazy one. All right, let's get to it. Jim Miller was born on October 26, 1861 in Van Buren, Arkansas. But he and his family would move to Franklin, Texas when Jim was about 1 year old. I don't know a whole lot about his parents, but his father was a man by the name of Jacob Miller. Jacob was 60 years old when Jim was born, so I guess age didn't impede his swimmers any. By trade, Jacob was a stonemason, and he actually helped build the first Capitol building in Austin, Texas. Not long after moving to Texas, Jacob would sadly pass away. His wife, Cynthia, took the kids and moved in with her parents. This would have been sometime between 1863 and 1869. Not a lot of hard dates to work with when it comes to Miller's early life. What we do know so far is kind of a sad story. Little boy loses his dad at a very early age. That's definitely a traumatic experience, and it's perfectly normal to deal with all kinds of mixed emotions and conflicting thoughts due to such a tragedy. But what's not normal is to kill your grandparents. And it looks like that's just what this little psychopath did. When Jim was just 8 years old, in 1869, both of his grandparents were found murdered in their home. And for whatever reason, there was enough evidence for the authorities to arrest young Jim over this. He got arrested, but not prosecuted. That's going to be a real big theme throughout this episode. I know we've made a lot of strides in recent years as far as mental health and rehabilitation goes, but I kind of feel like if you kill your grandparents when you're 8 years old, and you don't even get so much as a slap on the wrist over it, probably your fate is sealed. Probably you're just going to be a total psycho for the rest of your life. I mean, I wonder if there's even an instance where such a thing happened, and the person that killed their grandparents at 8 years of age actually went on to live a healthy and productive life.
Stop, Buster.
My dog's rolling around, grunting and scratching himself. Anyway, I don't even know what they did with little kid murderers back in the day. Nowadays, I'm assuming a kid that killed his grandparents would probably be put in some sort of juvenile detention center, probably at least until they were 18. You spend all those years in therapy, probably be highly medicated. In Jim's case, he was sent to go live with his sister's family. And in all fairness, we don't know anything about Jim's parents. Were they good people who gave birth to an evil son, or did they pass their own evil down on him?
Shut up, Buster.
I listen to a lot of true crime themed podcasts, and it always seems like most of these serial killers had something like really traumatic happen to them in early childhood. And the majority of them didn't exactly have the best parents ever. Serial killer and necrophile Ed Kemper killed both of his grandparents as well, but unlike Jim Miller, Ed was 15 as opposed to just 8 years old. Kemper would only serve 6 years in jail, by the way. He'd later go on to kill his mother. Just one more thing about Ed Kemper. I know he's a more modern-day serial killer. The guy's still alive, but there's something about him that I think lends itself to this episode. Ed was pretty messed up as a kid. He used to bury cats alive, and once they died, he'd dig them back up, cut their heads off, and place the heads on spikes. He also had some pretty serious mommy issues. There's no way of knowing for sure, but if I was a betting man, I'd place some money on the fact that old Deacon Jim Miller probably tortured small animals as a child. Also going to go out on a limb and just assume he probably didn't have the greatest relationship with his mother. I know this is all speculation, but to be as bloodthirsty as Miller was, and to have allegedly killed your own grandparents at the age of 8, there's got to be some underlying issues going on. And the whole torturing small animals thing definitely fits the profile. This wouldn't be the only family member that Miller would kill. By 1880, according to the census, Jim was living with his widowed mother and siblings, including his sister Georgia, who was married to a guy named John Thomas Coop. On July 30th, 1884, young Jim got into an argument with his brother-in-law, Coop. And just like a normal, well-adjusted human would do, he waited for his brother-in-law to fall asleep on the patio and then proceeded to blow his cotton-picking head off with a shotgun. Actually, I added the whole blowing his head off part. I don't know where he shot him. The results were the same, though. Coop was deader than HE double hockey sticks. Holy crap-oly, Deacon Jim! Sounds like you're going to be on Santa's naughty list. You know, after killing both grandparents and your brother-in-law, things are just going to be a little bit awkward at family get-togethers. And Miller actually did think out this murder. He had an alibi, albeit a weak one. Prior to killing Coop, he had been attending a Methodist church meeting, but a lady friend of his witnessed at the trial that he left around the time of the murder and didn't return until later on during the services. Also, pretty much everybody knew how much he hated his brother-in-law. Miller was arrested, he was convicted, and he was sentenced to life in prison. And just like that, the West was rid of another cold-blooded killer. No longer would Miller wield that deadly shotgun of his. All right, and that's going to wrap up this episode. Hope y'all enjoyed it. Feel free to rate and review on iTunes, and I will see you next week. JK. Just kidding. OMG. Did you really think I was done? Of course he would go on to kill more. Plenty more. Miller was just getting started at this point. He really did get sentenced to life in prison, but the verdict was overturned due to a technicality. Jim walked. And this is a pattern you're going to see a lot with Jim Miller. He'd get arrested many times, and he almost always got off without so much as a slap on the wrist. More on that later. So obviously Jim is probably not welcome in his now widowed sister's house anymore. So he headed to McCulloch County, Texas, and hired on as a hand on the ranch of Manning Clements Sr. I can't remember whether or not I talked about Manning Clements when I did my John Wesley Hardin episode. There were just so many people involved with the Taylor Sutton feud that it was hard to fit them all in. But Clements was a cousin of John Wesley Hardin, who would side with the Taylor faction. And he's a big reason why Hardin got involved in the feud. The Clements, both Manning Sr. and his son Manning Jr., were no strangers to violence. And Killer Jim wasn't just an employee on the Clements ranch. He became fast friends with both Sr. and Jr., and would even go on to marry Clements' daughter, which made him family. It was also during this time that Miller would get to know and become friends with fellow maniacal killer John Wesley Hardin. In 1887, Manning Clements Sr. was shot and killed in a saloon in Ballinger, Texas, by City Marshal Joe Townsend. It wasn't too long after that when Marshal Townsend was ambushed while riding home at night. The killer shot from the cover of darkness, and the shotgun blast ripped the marshal from the saddle. He survived, but he did lose an arm. That's right, a shotgun. Golly gee, I wonder who likes to wield a shotgun. Miller was never arrested for this, but he was widely suspected as the shooter. He also immediately left town. Which never makes someone look innocent when you flee from the scene of a crime. The next couple of years, Miller would just kind of wander the border area of Texas and Mexico. He would later brag that he, quote, had lost his notchstick on Mexicans he killed on the border. Notchstick, of course, referring to a stick that you carve a notch into for every man you killed. He went on to operate a saloon down in San Saba County for a little bit before becoming a deputy sheriff of Pecos, Texas. That's right, the guy that killed his own grandparents, his brother-in-law, and likely ambushed a city marshal would himself become a lawman. Times sure have changed, man. I got two friends, both infantry Marine veterans who did tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they're good people. They both tried getting on with my city's police department, and they didn't make the cut, unfortunately. They would have been great as cops. Whereas in the Jim Miller era of Texas, basically I think as long as you had a pulse and could pull a trigger, it looks like you'd get a job in law enforcement. I think part of it might have been with Texas being such a lawless area at this time. Maybe the mentality was you needed a killer to stop a killer. And also with Deacon Jim, he was somewhat of a bullshit artist. He had a way of convincing normal citizens that he was just a nice, devout Methodist. The sheriff Miller went to work for was a guy by the name of Bud Frazier. And Miller was good for a little bit. Per his MO, he would join the local Methodist congregation. He didn't drink or smoke or use bad language, so the church-going people were really accepting of him. Also, he started dressing like a Methodist preacher. He wore these long black frock coats, black boots, black Stetsons. And then he got married. I mentioned that before. He married Manning Clements' daughter Sally, and this marriage would take place in 1891. He convinced his new brother-in-law, Manning Jr., to join him and Sally in Pecos. Miller was even able to get Manning a job as a deputy sheriff, just like him. It was also around this time that the cattle rustling in the county had really increased. This caused Deacon Jim to spend more and more time on the range searching for the rustlers and horse thieves. Problem was, he never caught any. Probably because it was him doing all that stealing. His job as a lawman, as well as his reputation as a man of God, were the perfect covers for his crimes. This ruse of his may have worked on the naive townsfolk, but it didn't work on street-smart, equally deadly men, one of whom was a guy named Barney Riggs. Barney had just got out of a Yuma prison for killing a man, and while he was in prison, he had killed 2 other convicts. He was also Sheriff Frazier's brother-in-law. So many golly dang brother-in-laws in this episode. Barney suggested to Sheriff Frazier that if he fired Miller, maybe some of the cattle and horse theft would decrease. You think? He also publicly accused Miller of being behind all that rustling. And this kind of split the town in two. Unfortunately, all those good church-going folks sided with Deacon Jim. And the sheriff, being an elected official, also not having any rock-solid proof, ended up keeping Miller on as deputy. A decision he'd regret just a few weeks later when Miller killed a Mexican prisoner who was supposedly trying to escape. Once again, going back to my John Wesley Hardin episode, a lot of prisoners got killed, quote, escaping in Texas back in those days. It was just a nice, convenient way of killing somebody who you thought might need killing. And the reason Jim Miller thought this guy needed killing was because he was about to snitch on the good deacon about where he had hidden some stolen mules. This info was leaked to the sheriff, and sure enough, he found the stolen mules just where the man said Jim had hidden them. This was all the proof Frazier needed. He immediately fired Killin Jim. That lawman racket was too good for Miller just to let slip out of his hands like that, though. Since he got fired as a deputy, he flippin' ran against Bud Frazier in the next flippin' sheriff's election. He lost, but he was able to get elected to the office of city marshal. Man, you know that had to really tick Frazier off. He fired this narrative well, and now he's got to work with him as a colleague and an equal. Bet it really stuck in his craw. I bet it really chapped his hide. Newly elected Pecos Marshal Jim Miller no longer kept up his pious appearance. He started surrounding himself with gun hands, killers like himself and his brother-in-law Manning Clements. And they basically just took over the town, to the point that the normal citizens, the ones who once backed this Deacon Jim, were now afraid to leave their homes. Someone got word to Sheriff Frazier about the state of affairs in the town of Pecos, and he immediately made plans to head home and deal with this son of a biscuit Miller once and for all. But Miller had the same idea. He gathered his gunmen and planned on ambushing the sheriff. Only somebody overheard his plans and sent a wire to the sheriff warning him. So when Frazier did arrive, he did so flanked by Texas Rangers. The assassination attempt was foiled. This was bad news for Con Gibson, the good guy who warned the sheriff. He himself was murdered shortly thereafter for this good deed. And Frazier knew it was Miller behind the murder, but he had no way to prove it. Man, that's got to be frustrating. You're a respected sheriff. You actually care about keeping the peace. And this guy is constantly flaunting his outlaw ways in front of you. You're pretty sure he was planning on killing you, and you're also pretty sure the man that he killed likely saved your life. It was too much for Sheriff Bud Frazier to take. He finally confronted Miller on the street, accused him of being a horse thief and a murderer, pulled his pistol and fired, pumping 2 rounds into Miller, one in his chest and another in his arm. Miller tried to fire back, but his shots went wild. As soon as Miller went down, Sheriff fed the frick up. Bud Frazier walked over to old Deacon Jim and calmly put 3 more rounds into his chest. If you're keeping track at home, that's 4 pistol rounds to Miller's chest and 1 in the arm. But the man wouldn't die. And there's a good reason for that. It's also the reason behind him always wearing those long Methodist frock coats, no matter how hot it was. Under his shirt was a steel plate that stopped the bullets. I'm not making this up. The dude wore a steel plate under his clothes, kind of like a Wild West bulletproof jacket, as well as that long coat to conceal it. In the South Texas heat. Holy guacamole. Texas is hot, y'all. I've worked in extremely hot environments, machine shops, hot-ass attics, outside in the summer. I've had to walk myself back from the cusp of heat stroke many, many times, but I dang sure wasn't wearing several layers of clothing, including a heavy-ass steel plate and a long coat. I don't know how he did it, but I guess it worked for him. That steel plate literally saved his life that day. He was bruised all to hell but alive, and he swore that once he got back on his damn feet, he was going to kill Bud Frazier. He actually went so far as to say he'd kill him, even if he had to crawl 20 miles on his knees to do so. And shit, I did just cuss, I realize that. You know it wasn't going to last forever. Anyway, back to the story. Once again, the town of Pecos was polarized. Obviously, the sheriff was out of line. He drew on Miller first, taking the law into his hands, and without any actual real proof. Then again, he was a man that was pushed to the brink. Deacon Jim also had yet another conversion while recuperating. Because, of course, had to get the public on his side once again. And I can't help but wonder if the Methodists of Pecos, Texas in the late 19th century were the most gullible people of all time, or just really wanted to give this guy the benefit of the doubt. Either way, it worked. Frazier lost re-election to the sheriff's position. At this point, he was probably sorry he ever heard of the name of Jim Miller, and probably not too happy with the citizens of the county. He seemed legitimately concerned about their safety when Miller was running roughshod over them, and they just didn't re-elect him. Probably feeling a little bit butthurt, he left town. Hell, he left the whole damn state. Matter of fact, he moved all the way to New Mexico. He would return to Pecos briefly, though, take care of some personal matters. And the Miller-Frazier feud kicked right back up where they left off. Once back in town, he heard that Miller was on the prowl for him, and I guess Frazier said, fuck it. I'm not sheriff anymore, let me go ahead and open up this dance. He had his Winchester on him at this time, and as soon as he saw Deacon Jim, he opened fire, hitting the man 4 times. Once in the leg, once in the arm, and twice in the chest. But that fucking steel plate, man. You'd think Frazier would have learned from the first encounter and tried for a headshot, but he didn't. Frazier got arrested, and Jim Miller called in for some special assistance in the way of John Wesley Hardin. If you'll remember, Hardin and Miller became friends years before through Manning Clements. In the meantime, Hardin just did several years in prison for murder, during which he got his law degree. So I don't know if he called Hardin in for his lawyer services, or if it was just an attempted intimidation. Doesn't matter though, Frazier was acquitted, just like everybody else, and Hardin would be killed before the retrial took place. That's a common theme in Texas in those days. I'm surprised even Hardin got arrested and sent to prison. Everybody was acquitted. Anyway, this Miller-Frazier beef wasn't over just yet. Frazier returned to New Mexico, but once again came back to Texas to visit family a little while later. I guess he did learn a little something from that steel plate, because this time he came packing a pistol with some sort of explosive rounds, whatever that means. Didn't do him any good though. As Frazier sat in the saloon playing poker, Miller snuck up, stuck his trusty shotgun through the door, and unloaded both barrels on Bud Frazier, literally ripping the man's head off his shoulders. The body is supposedly still set at the table, now missing a head. Of course, Miller was arrested, but not before warning any and all supporters of former Sheriff Frazier to get the fuck out of his town. Many did, but not Barney Riggs. Remember him, that hard ass who was the first one to warn Frazier that Miller was no good? Nah, he stuck around. Why? Because fuck Jim Miller, that's why. 2 of Miller's henchmen caught up with Riggs in the saloon, but Riggs put a bullet between one man's eyes and chased the other into the street where he blew the back of the man's head off. I can't believe I've never heard of Barney Riggs before. This is a genuine tough guy. And probably, based on what I'm about to say, just a tad bit insane. After killing the second man, he proceeded to scoop up the brains off the ground, promising to send them to a widow of someone that Miller had previously killed. What the blankety blank? Barney Riggs sounds like the kind of guy that would have no qualms ripping off your face and wiping his ass with it. He was arrested, tried for murder, and you guessed it, he got acquitted. So many acquittals. This is about the same time that Miller stood trial for murdering Bud Frazier. The first trial resulted in a hung jury. And then, while awaiting the retrial, Miller found the Lord again. Hallelujah! He held regular prayer meetings with his minister, and then, surprise, surprise, he got acquitted by the second jury in January of 1899. This guy is the original Teflon Don. No charges ever seem to stick. For whatever reason, maybe now that Frazier was dead, Deacon Jim moved to Memphis, Texas. Way up there in the Texas Panhandle, where once again he got a job as a deputy sheriff, because why not? He also started bragging more around this time about his murders. He got in trouble again, convicted of suborning perjury, basically paying a guy to lie during a trial, but the guy turned state witness, double-crossed Miller. Deacon Jim told people that nobody can do that to him and live. He said, "Watch the paper, boys." 3 weeks later, the papers reported the man's death. Miller gunned him down from a concealed location. But he wasn't done yet. One of the district attorneys who had prosecuted him stayed the night at a Memphis hotel. The next morning, the man was dead. Officially, the cause of death was peritonitis. So a quick Google search tells me that peritonitis is an inflammation of the peritoneum, the tissue that lines the inner walls of the abdomen and covers and supports most of your abdominal organs. Peritonitis is usually caused by an infection from bacteria or fungi. Left untreated, peritonitis can rapidly spread into the blood and to other organs, resulting in multiple organ failure and death. Symptoms may include abdominal tenderness, chills, fever, not passing any urine or significantly less urine, difficulty passing gas, vomiting, lower back aches, sleepiness, an itchy foot, an increased appetite, and an aversion to loud noises. So if your back hurts, you're sleepy, and for some reason your foot just started itching, and you hate sudden loud noises, sorry, there's a good chance you have peritonitis. You're probably almost totally assured that, you're going to die soon. Sorry. I did make up those last 5 symptoms. I'm sure you'll be fine. But still, maybe not. You know what else causes organ failure? Arsenic. The doctor who examined the body would later admit to it. He just put down peritonitis because he was scared of Miller doing the same thing to him. Plus, doctors like writing fancy words that none of us normal people know the meaning of. Turns out Miller had the hotel clerk poison the attorney's food. And don't you know, the cook went missing afterwards as well. Miller then moved his family to Fort Worth, Texas. He and his wife opened up a boarding house, and Jim got involved in real estate speculation. He also did like he's always done, joined the local Methodist church. This is the year 1900 now. No longer the Wild West, but there were still some legit killers like Miller who just slipped through the cracks. And there were still problems that some thought could only be solved by the barrel of a gun. Also by this point, Miller's reputation would have preceded him to Fort Worth. He was soon hired by cattlemen to kill off sheep ranchers. That was actually a thing, believe it or not. There was a weird misconception in those days that cattle wouldn't graze on the same land after a sheep herd grazed on it. This obviously isn't true. A lot of people nowadays both own sheep and cattle on the same land. But back in those old days, cattle ranchers despised sheep herders. I'm oversimplifying it. There were a lot of laws and stuff that played in and caused all this, but the fact of the matter was that the big cattle ranchers didn't want any sheep anywhere near their outfits. And when they couldn't win in the court of law, they would resort to less than legal practices. That's where a man like Killin Jim Miller came into play. He charged $150 a job. The job, of course, was killing sheep ranchers. In this capacity, he may have killed more than a dozen men. Some by ambush, as he usually did, and others he just claimed it was self-defense. It wasn't long before he moved on to killing farmers whose fences got in the way of the ranchers' cattle herds. In 1904, he got paid $500 for killing a lawyer named James Garrett. Garrett committed the cardinal sin of representing some small farmers in court against the big cattle ranches. Jim would now start to get a little bit flashy. He took to wearing fancy diamond rings. And I mentioned earlier how he got into the land speculation trade. This has long been a con throughout Texas history. Basically, you sell useless land to people who don't know any better. In Miller's case, he sold lots that were submerged in the Gulf of Mexico. One of his salesmen didn't appreciate selling people land in the damn ocean and threatened to out Miller as a fraudster. which caused Miller, of course, to gun him down in a hotel bathroom. Once again, he got off, this time for bribing somebody to testify a false alibi. A year later, in 1906, Miller took a job in Oklahoma. There were a couple outlaw brothers who were highly pissed off at U.S. Marshal Ben Collins. I guess during the course of arresting the two, Collins shot and crippled one of them. So, of course, they wanted revenge, and who better to extract it than Deacon Jim? One night, Marshal Collins was riding his horse just outside of his house when a blast of buckshot knocked him out of the saddle. The next blast he took to the face, killing him. Collins was a tough motherfucker, though. After getting blown off his horse with the first shot, he was able to get all 4 rounds from his pistol before receiving that fatal second shot to the face. He was also well liked. His murder pissed off the local populace. It didn't take long to figure out that the outlaw brothers had hired Miller to do the hit for a sum of $1,800. That's not bad money. $1,800 in 1906 would be over $50,000 in today's money. That's more than a lot of people make in a year. And you know what happened next. Miller was arrested, spent some time in jail, but was finally released on bail. This man got released on bail after ambushing and shooting a U.S. Marshal in the face. That blows my mind. This release was just in the nick of time. He had a new target to take out in Mexico. And not just anyone, we've all heard of this next guy. His name was Pat Garrett, the man that most rational people believe killed Billy the Kid. Officially, we can't know for sure that Miller killed Garrett. A guy named Wayne Brazel actually confessed to the murder. But he was found innocent in a court of law. His story just didn't hold water. Even the day after Brazel was arrested, the Las Cruces newspaper printed an article saying that many people doubted it went down the way Brazel claimed. So here's the deal. Brazel had leased some land from Garrett, and it turned out he wanted to graze sheep on it. Can't have that, so Garrett decided to kick Brazel off his land. Garrett and another guy were riding in a wagon when the other guy, let's just call him the witness, claimed Brazel rode up next to the buggy, which resulted in him and Garrett getting into an argument. Garrett finally grabbed his shotgun and said something along the lines of, "You'll either get off my land or I'll get you off of it," which resulted in Brazel pulling his gun and shooting Garrett twice in self-defense. He then rode to town and turned himself in. The problem is, Garrett's shotgun was only loaded with birdshot. Not exactly a weapon to get into a gunfight with. Also, when Garrett's body was found, his pants were unzipped and his hands were still in his heavy gloves. And based on the entrance and exit wounds, it appeared that he had been shot in the back, maybe while trying to take a piss. Some people claim that it was actually Miller who shot Garrett. Supposedly he was posing as a cattleman wanting to buy the land that Garrett had leased to Brazel. Garrett was in the wagon that day with the witness, heading to meet Killer Miller to finalize the sale. And not only that, but the witness was a relative of Miller's. Most historians seriously question whether or not Miller was involved in Garrett's death. There's a lot of speculation and no real hard evidence. Miller wasn't even arrested in the case, and like I said, Brazel was acquitted. To this day, there's not an official killer of Pat Garrett. So did Miller do it or not? I have no idea. Anyway, Jim was offered another job in Oklahoma, the place where he was just released on bail for murder, so he headed north. And for good reason. This job paid $2,000, worth about $60,000 in today's money. I'm not sure what the going rate is nowadays to hire a hitman, but I feel like $60,000 would be on the high end. Old Killer Miller obviously had a strong reputation as a guy who could get the job done, which, does seem to be the case. The target was a guy named Gus Bobbitt. As far as I know, no relation to John Wayne Bobbitt or Lorena Bobbitt. Also, as far as I know, this Gus Bobbitt guy still had his penis attached. Gus Bobbitt was a business owner in Ada, Oklahoma, who had gotten into a pretty bitter feud with some local saloon operators. I'm not really sure about the details of the feud, but the saloon operators did end up leaving town. They moved to Texas, where they hired Jim Miller to wait until Bobbitt fell asleep, cut his dick off, and throw it out of a moving vehicle where a police officer would later find it, rush it to a hospital, and have doctors sew it back on successfully. Years later, Bobbitt would star in a movie called Frankenpenis. No, I'm sorry, just playing around. No more penis cutting off jokes. If you're under the age of 35, you probably don't even know what the hell I'm talking about. But back in the 90s, there was a guy named John Wayne Bobbitt who was really abusive to his wife, so one night she cut his pee-pee off. He later appeared in 2 porn films. It was also fuel to a ton of late-night talk show and stand-up comedy jokes, so I can't hear or read the name Bobbitt and not immediately think of penis cutting off jokes. Those Ada saloon owners hired Jim Miller to kill Gus Bobbitt, not the other thing. Which of course he did. It was his usual MO. He ambushed the man at night in the cover of darkness with a shotgun. Gus didn't immediately die, though. He lingered for about an hour before finally giving up the ghost with his head resting on his wife's lap. But not before telling his wife how to dispose of his property, including a $1,000 reward for whoever captured the man that killed him. Arrogant Jim Miller didn't cover his tracks too well. I mean, why would he? Who cares if he got arrested? He always managed to escape any type of punishment. This time would be different, however. It didn't take long for law enforcement from Oklahoma to track down and arrest Miller as well as the men who hired him to kill Bobbitt. They were all extradited back to Ada and put behind bars. Miller, though, remained unconcerned. He lived high on the hog while in jail. He ate steak brought in from a local cafe. He had carpet placed in his cell. had fresh sheets for his bed every morning. He just did not give any fucks. He could afford the best lawyers money could buy and a small army of Texas cattlemen who would testify on his behalf. Already the wires and letters were pouring in claiming that Deacon Jim Miller was just a man of high moral character. The lawyer he retained went by the name of Moman Pruitt. Counselor Pruitt won 304 out of 342 murder cases, and not once were one of his defendants ever executed. The citizens of Ada knew how slippery Miller was. And now that he hired the damn Johnny Cochran of the Wild West, it was almost assured that he'd once again be acquitted. Just like all those other times. That and the arrogance of Miller living better than some of them while behind bars was just too much to bear. They decided not to wait for a trial. In the early hours of April 19th, 1909, 40-some-odd men broke into the Ada jailhouse. They tied up the jail guards and dragged Miller, along with his 3 conspirators, out of their cells and down an alley behind a livery stable. There would be no trial or fancy lawyers this time. Very little time was wasted. The 3 conspirators were immediately lynched. The mob basically threw the nooses over the rafters of the stable and the men were jerked up. One thing about being hung, you want to make it a clean job. If the noose is tied correctly and there's a long drop, then your neck will be broke and you'll die pretty much instantly. That's why they used scaffolds back in the old days, or they just hang you from a tree and slap the horse out from underneath you. If not done properly, like in this case, and there's no drop, it's not a clean or easy death. These men just hung there, slowly writhing and twitching. They saved Deacon Jim Miller for last. They implored him to confess his crimes. Cool as a cucumber, Miller said, quote, "Let the record show I've killed 51 men. He calmly removed his fancy diamond ring and asked that it be sent home to his wife. And then, as the noose was being placed around his neck, he requested his trademark long black coat. This request was denied. The townspeople had enough of his arrogance. Even his lack of concern to being executed with a noose already around his neck pissed them off. He asked for the coat a couple more times, and finally one of the lynch mob placed Miller's hat on the side of his head. Miller then laughed and said, "I'm ready now. You couldn't kill me otherwise. Let her rip." Let her rip they did, pulling his body up and leaving him to convulse and writhe under the stable rafters. After a while, his body stopped jerking. Deacon Jim Miller was dead, gone to meet his maker in the great Methodist church in the sky. Before dispersing, someone in the mob placed Jim's frock coat around his shoulders, saying it won't help him now. All 4 bodies were left hanging under the rafters for everyone to see. And I do mean everyone. A picture was taken. Just Google Deacon Jim Miller and you'll find it. Just be warned though, it is a picture of 4 dead men hanging from nooses. So if, dead people being lynched disturb you, don't look at it. Miller can be seen on the far left, black hat tilted on his head and long black coat around his shoulders. He was 47 at the time of his death. Nobody ever found out who the 40 members of the lynch mob were. And I doubt anybody really cared. An Ada, Oklahoma historian would later write, quote, "The 40-odd men who took part in the lynching were honorable men, for the most part, who had patiently endured desperado rule until it could no longer be tolerated. It can be written down as the one mob action in America entirely justified in the eyes of God and man." End quote. I don't know about all that. Mob justice is never a good thing. But I guess I do understand why they did it. And by taking the law into their own hands, they surely saved the lives of others. Miller was in his killing prime. There was no indication he was slowing down or planning to retire. He surely would have taken more contracts. So, right or wrong, the citizens of Ada forced him to retire. Straight to the grave. That grave, by the way, is located in the Oakwood Cemetery in Fort Worth, Texas. His simple headstone reads J.B. Miller, husband. His wife Sally would live another 29 years and was buried there right beside Jim. One final thought I had when pondering just the absolute lack of law and order in Texas at this time. I mean, just look at how many people in today's episodes were clearly guilty and they got acquitted. Any justice that was served was with a gun or a vigilante noose. The more I think about it, the more I think that the Wild West kind of went by prison rules. If you're in prison, little everyday things that most of us civilized people overlook can't be overlooked. Is your cellmate not cleaning the toilet? You gotta check him. Even something as simple as somebody reaching over your plate of food to grab something can't be overlooked. Everyone in there is a wolf. If they sense you're a sheep, they're going to pounce. And it seems like to me, the Old West was kind of the same way. And maybe that's what makes it so appealing. You had to survive by your own grit. Even if you're a simple farmer or a cowboy, you'd find yourself in a saloon rubbing shoulders with hardened killers like Miller or John Hardin. And then what the fuck do you do? There's a great Johnny Cash song called The Last Gunfighter Ballad. It's about a gunfighter who lived to be an old man and him just remembering the old days. There's a line that goes, "The old gunfighter stood on the porch and stared into the sun, and relived all the old days back when he was living by the gun. When deadly games of pride were played, and living was mistakes not made, and the thought of the smell of the black powder smoke, and the stand in the street at the turn of a joke. The thought of the smell of the black powder smoke, and the stand in the street at the turn of a joke." And I think that's the Old West. The stand in the street of a turn of the joke. The idea that somebody slights you in a trivial way back in those days, and you got to settle with your guns. Every now and then an article will be written about how we have it all wrong. The Old West wasn't that wild. And, killings were very rare. While it's true there weren't really any stand-up in the street, high noon, fast draw shootouts, you can't deny that the Old West was largely unlawful. Just look at what we talked about in this episode. The court system was totally corrupt in Texas back in those days. Justice was never served. So sometimes tough men took the law into their own hands. I doubt Deacon Jim really killed 51 men. Those numbers are always inflated. But I bet you he killed a couple of dozen. And he never saw the inside of a prison once. The point being, you couldn't rely on the town marshal or the sheriff to protect you back in those days. First of all, they might be damn outlaws themselves. And secondly, you can arrest somebody, but chances are that guy's going to get back on the street and he's going to be gunning for you soon. I don't even know where I'm going with this. I'm rambling. I guess we'll wrap up this episode. As always, I appreciate all the feedback and comments I've been getting. Thank you all so much for listening. I got a really nice email from a guy named Joel. If you remember back, I think it was the episode on John Coulter, I tried to explain the whole setting a beaver trap process. Well, Joel wrote in, and he says he traps beaver for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and Joel tells me you set the trap in 1 inch of water and put beaver caster on it. Territorial beavers will get pissed, they go in there and investigate and see who the fuck's in their territory, and that's how they get caught. Longer chains plus heavier traps just drown the critter. Yeah, Joel, I knew that. I was just seeing if you knew that. Testing your beaver knowledge, bro. No, I'm just kidding. Thank you for writing in and setting the record straight. A guy that goes by the name of Creatures of Darkness on YouTube requested that I do an episode on Ben Thompson. And heck yeah, I think I will. I don't know when, but he's on my list. Ben Thompson was just like a lot of these guys I cover. He was sometimes a lawman, and he was sometimes on the other side of that line. Born in England, Ben was a gambler and a gunfighter. He fought in the Civil War as well as fighting under Emperor Maximilian down in Mexico. He spent some time in those tough cow towns like Abilene and brushed shoulders with guys like Wild Bill Hickok and Wyatt Earp. So yeah, that will be a fun episode to do. Speaking of Mexico, I did get a request to do an episode on Pancho Villa, particularly on his invasion of the town of Columbus, New Mexico. Man, I'm not sure, but the more I think about it, the more I might just want to do that episode. A lot of the Pancho Villa stuff took place after what's considered the Wild West. I feel like I really towed the line even in this episode, taking it into the 1900s. I mean, this is a Wild West podcast, so I can't be doing stuff like in the 1950s and, shit like that. But the more I do this stuff, the more I realize that depending on the area, the Wild West didn't just mysteriously end when the clock struck midnight on January 1st, 1900. And at that time, parts of Mexico were still as wild as can be. Geronimo surrendered in 1886. But did you know that as late as the 1920s, they were still experiencing Apache raids in Mexico? I just recently found this out and it blew my fucking mind. A few Apaches slipped past the U.S. Army and took refuge in remote areas of Mexico. Raids were happening just like in the 1850s. Scalps were being taken. Even as late as 1934, there were Apache holdouts in the Mexican Sierras. That's fucking crazy. That means that right now there could potentially be a 90-year-old Apache still alive that was born wild and free in Mexico whose parents were warriors. Holy shit. So yeah, maybe I will do a Pancho Villa episode. Brush up on my Espanol. Muchas gracias for the suggestion. Dan Buck, who I interviewed on my last episode, sent me a cool email talking about the phenomenon of fake Wild West pictures. Evidently, there's a huge profit to be made finding these old flea market pictures and getting a quote expert to authenticate the photo for you. This has already been done a few times with Billy the Kid. He sent me a really interesting article that he wrote on the topic titled Adventures in Wonderland, Identifying Old West Photos. And I will put a link to the article in this episode's description. Really cool stuff. And just goes to show you, you got to be skeptical when it comes to all this history stuff. There's so much bogus stuff out there. I'm sure I've probably talked a lot about bogus stuff on here already. Even this episode, is there proof that Jim Miller actually killed his grandparents when he was 8? No, not really. Maybe it didn't happen. Most of the stuff I read on him did claim that he was arrested at the age of 8 for this atrocity, but I don't know the sources. I'm no historian, and that's my go-to defense anytime I get something wrong. I'm not a historian. Gives me all kinds of leeway to be stupid. Also, I'm working on getting a website set up. I do now own the domain of bloodybeaver.com. So now if I can just figure out how to make a website, we'll be in business. So keep an eye out on that. Okay, I guess that's it. Once again, not real sure on my next topic, but I got a lot of topics to choose from. Have yourself a merry little Christmas or a Hanukkah or whatever you're celebrating this holiday season. Hope you get some good food in you. I personally plan on stuffing myself with plenty of ham, turkey, dressing, and various casseroles over the course of the next week. Also hoping to squeeze in another quick hunting trip before the season's over. I'm totally going to go all Deacon Jim Miller on any legal whitetail bucks I see. Adios and vaya con Dios.